Okay. All right. So today, before I move on into Genesis 12 and start actually going through the narrative of the history of the Hebrews, which will be a lot easier once we get into that portion of Genesis, because that's a lot more straightforward, a lot easier to explain, a lot easier to understand. Um, Before we do that, though, I'm going to wrap up the discussion we've been having for the first several chapters of Genesis by, first of all, covering some topics that I didn't quite cover, probably like I should have when I went through them the first time. I went through and actually watched all these videos on myself talking, and decided there were a few things that I didn't elaborate on quite to the degree that I felt like I should have. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I'm going to go into a study of some of the important words in the original Hebrew. I don't normally do this, and I have said this many times. This is something that I don't normally feel is really necessary, but I do think it's necessary to cover some of these words here, because well, I'll get to that when I get to that. The first thing, I have a few different topics that I wanted to cover that I should have covered a little bit more in depth when I read through them, and I didn't. And I'm going to go ahead and just start here. The first one is the tree of life. We didn't really talk about the tree of life when I went through the text in chapter 2 and 3, which discussed it. The tree of life itself is in the background. It isn't emphasized very much. It's one of the two special trees, to one of the two specific trees that are named and listed as being different from the rest. But no attention is really drawn to it in the narrative. Adam and Eve don't eat from it until the most intriguing thing about it, as far as the text itself goes, is that at the end of Genesis 3, when God kicks Adam and Eve out of the garden, he does so on the reasoning that he does not want man to reach out his hand and eat from the tree of life and live forever. So there is some information about the tree of life in that statement, but other than that, the tree of life itself is very much in the background during the Genesis narrative. But it's important. The tree of life concept is important. It was a common concept, and you have to remember, again, these people lived in a desert or in mountainous wilderness. Okay, it's like this. They did not. I think one of the things that makes it difficult sometimes for us in our culture today and with our history as we have experienced it and as we've gone through it, like the U.S., the Western world, but the U.S. in particular, is very fertile. When they got here 200, 300, 400 years ago, and they started going across the continent, it was like a green desert, just a desert of grass. No one had ever seen anything like it. At that point in world history, there wasn't anything like it. Okay, it's like now we have exploited it, and we've been using it for the last 300-400 years. Okay, but we're not really familiar in large sections of this landmass, of this country in which this culture has developed. We're not really familiar with the idea that space in which to grow useful food is limited. Okay, like we just don't. That's not part of our cultural background. We've had an abundance. When we got here, when the European settlers got here and took over the continent, there was fertility and abundance. We still, to this day, 400 years later, we don't really have a problem finding land to grow crops out of. Okay, that's not to say that every square inch of the North American continent or the South American continent or whatever is completely always fertile, but it's just our cultural background and our history, our geographical history, what we're used to, what we see, what we're surrounded with, what we see when we look around all the time, is very, 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 very different from what these people back then saw. What they saw was desert and mountains. Okay, wilderness, wasteland, uninhabitable space. And so every inch of fertile ground was very, very precious to them, and it was worth fighting for. It was worth dying for. Um, and so the tree of life concept, this idea of a tree or a garden, even the garden motif itself, is common throughout that region of the world as being like this ideal of fertility and life and abundance. When Genesis talks about the Garden of Eden, they're not the author, the Genesis account, the Hebrew, the Israelite account of creation, isn't different than what a lot of the cultures around them thought in terms of this is what abundance looks like. This is what it means to have life in abundance, or fertile soil, or just an endless source of water that just takes care of the ground for us. Because that's not what they lived in. That's not what they experienced. They lived in desert. They experienced hard work and toil just to get water to grow their plants. And later on we get to Genesis, we're going to see fights between Abraham's family and the people around them over wells, like who controls the wells, who controls the water. Now, again, we don't experience that. In our history, we have not experienced that. Okay, so as the church has developed and as the church has gone through history in this part of the world over the last couple of hundred years, we haven't experienced the fight for resources the way that these people would have just constantly dealt with. So the garden motif and the tree of life motif itself doesn't speak to us the way it spoke to them. Kings of the time, the way you became great. I talk about the idea of becoming great. Well, the mark of a great king, there's a couple different things, a couple different ways that a king could mark his greatness, could leave a visible imprint of his greatness on the people and on history. One was to be a great warrior. We read about Nimrod being a mighty hunter before the Lord, and possibly the first big game hunter, or popularized big game hunting. One would have been another way, and he was also probably a hunter of men. So another way to be a warrior, to be a great fighter. Kings at that point in time, well, really a little bit later than once they actually started developing kingdoms. Up through Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel and following, there's really no indication that they had kingdoms or nations the way that we think of ever since. But even in the era of the kings and the kingdoms that came along later, and for many centuries thereafter, the king was supposed to be the best fighter. That's what basically made you king. If you're a pharaoh of Egypt and you're going out to war, you're in the front of the army. You're not in the back. Okay, you're not hiding out in the back watching everybody else go out in front of you. That's the way that warfare developed over time. Okay, we're familiar with warfare where the generals don't take the field. Well, nowadays we have remote bombs or drones or whatever. It's like the kind of warfare that factors into our cultural history is the kind of warfare in which the generals are the safest people in the battle because they're not actually out fighting. That is not the way it was in the ancient world, where the most powerful fighter was the king, and the king was the most powerful fighter. Like, you became king by being the best fighter. That was basically your criteria. Another way, so the pharaoh, for example, of Egypt, would lead the army from the front. Alexander the Great in Greece led the army from the front. He was in the front of the army. David, when he's king, leads the army from the front. Now later on, as he gets older, his generals and commanders tell him to not do that, to stop fighting, to stop going out into battle with them. But that's what made you king. Like, that was pretty much, these two things went together to a large degree. You were the king because you were the best fighter. You were the best fighter because you were king. Like, these two things just went together. Another way that you became great, another major accomplishment, was to be a builder. Nebuchadnezzar, a guy coming along in Babylon in the around 600 AD, BC. Nebuchadnezzar is going to be a proud builder. We talk about the Tower of Babel. He's going to try to rebuild that. One of the things that he tries to do in his day and time is rebuild the Tower of Babel, finish that tower. We have a lot of his own inscriptions written by his own hand, or a scribe writing in his name, talking about what a magnificent builder is. Even in Daniel, when we actually see him, the one spot in the Bible where he actually appears as a character in the story in the book of Daniel, in Daniel 4, he has a moment of boasting about how great this city is, this empire is that he's built. The idea of being a builder was great. Of course, one of the stories about Nebuchadnezzar, it's not in the Bible, but it's from other sources of history, is the idea of these hanging gardens. He somehow supposedly figured out a way to hang gardens from the ceiling. Okay, I don't know necessarily what basis in fact that has, but it was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the hanging gardens of Babylon. But the idea of the garden itself is common. He wasn't the only guy, the only king or emperor who wanted to be known for making great gardens. Because yet again, these people lived in a desert. Okay, that's a very harsh, inhospitable, wasteland area of the world. Israel itself is fertile. That's why they fought over the hill country of Israel. That's why they fought over it. Okay, that's why they wanted it. That's why God promised that particular spot of land to them, because it was good land. You know, Egypt's culture endured for so many centuries, millennia even, because of the Nile. The Nile would flood every year, and when it would recede, it left these deposits of soil behind, or silt they could use to fertilize their fields. And that, the strength of that river and the predictability of the Nile doing that every single year is what allowed Egypt to rise and become such a powerful nation and endure for so long. Okay, whereas other nations came and went during, many times over during that time. So the idea of wanting to build a garden and being known for building a garden and desiring to live in a lush, fertile, well-watered garden was a deeply held dream and desire of the people of this potential time. And so the imagery that is being evoked here with the Garden of Eden, or the Garden in Eden itself, this idea, Eden itself means like delight or paradise, and there's a garden in Eden. Eden itself is somewhere east of here, according to the scriptures, somewhere east of Israel. Which again, east of Israel, and east of Israel was a desert. I don't know if the intent is that we're supposed to think that desert was originally Eden, or if it's even farther than east than that, in Babylon or wherever, which is basically where Abraham came from. I'm not sure how far east you have to go to get to Eden. I wouldn't be surprised if the idea that Moses is communicating here is that desert that's directly to their east is where the garden used to be. This is what happened to the garden after human sin or the flood or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, that's possible, because that's possible. All we know is that it's east. It's east of Israel. Somewhere in the east is Eden, or was Eden. And this tree of life was there, and mankind did not eat from the tree of life. They were allowed to. That was not the tree that was forbidden to them or prohibited. They could eat from any tree in the garden, including the tree of life. It was singled out as one of the two special trees, but it was not the tree that they were told not to eat from. They ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil because they wanted to be like God. And I said when I covered that material that God wants us to be like Him too. But He wants us to do it the way that He has prescribed for us to do it. We could have become like Him by eating of the tree of life. We didn't choose to do that. And so we chose to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil instead. And when that happens, we were barred from eating the tree of life. This imagery comes up again, the lampstand that they make at the end of Exodus, they use in their tabernacle and temple, is in the shape of a tree. The imagery that they put in their tabernacle and temple was designed to evoke thoughts and remembrances of Eden, of the garden, of paradise, of delight. The tree of life in the middle of, there's cherubim, there's fruits, there's pomegranates, there's these palm trees, there's these different garden-based images that were built into the tabernacle and the temple, along with the lampstand, which was shaped like the tree of life, to remind them that that's... Why am I fuzzy? I don't understand cameras. I don't know how that works. To remind them that is where they were supposed to be, where we're going. Jesus, of course, will talk about Himself being the bread of life and for the water of life. At the end of Revelation, the tree of life is in the city of God, and the river of life comes from the throne of God. So mankind will yet eat of the tree of life. The tree of life is God's way of letting us become like Him, not our way. Our way of becoming like God always ends up leading to pain, suffering, sin, death, disaster, separation, and all that unpleasant stuff. God wants us to be like Him too, and He has provided a way for that to happen. For us to do that, we must eat of the tree of life, not of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Something else, kind of, I was mentioning during that little segment there about Nimrod being the mighty hunter. So, and after the flood, apparently, according to the way it's presented in the text, um, people and animals began eating meat. Apparently, that didn't happen before, not even after the curse of Genesis 3. And so, after the flood, meat eating became permissible and common. Men began to hunt animals, and animals began to hunt other animals to eat. I think this is one of the things that helped keep mankind from falling back into a similar predicament they were in before, where the whole world's full of violence. Because now they had to contend with animal violence. They had, every time they went anywhere, every time they did anything, they had to factor in the animal kingdom attacking them, or build walls around their cities to keep. So that would have been, I think, just another way of keeping the whole earth from falling into the same pattern of violence that we had before the flood. I think another thing that would have kept that from happening would have been this, obviously, the splitting of the nations through their languages, because then that creates tribalism. If each family, or each large family unit or tribe, gets its own language, they're going to stick together compared to the other tribes. So there's now going to be tribalism and closeness in the family units, which will also help keep the the earth widespread from being full of violence as it was in the days before Noah. Apparently, before the flood, God didn't really give mankind any prohibitions on what not to do. He told them not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. He told them not to do that. Even when Cain commits Abel, God didn't specifically tell him not to murder Abel. He told him to master his urge to sin. He knew he wanted to. He told him to master his urge to sin. Cain didn't. But he didn't specifically tell him not to murder Abel. He punished Cain for that act. But there's no indication that he specifically said, don't do this again to anybody. It doesn't seem as though he gave them any specific prohibitions of what not to do in life, what is off limits, what is out of bounds. And so I believe the pre-flood world reflects a situation where mankind just literally just does whatever he wants to do, and that's where that road inevitably leads. Okay, so right now I'm going to go ahead and I'm gonna go ahead and start a new video.